books together. And then we'll look at some of the books that we looked at, and then we'll also look at some more recently published books and have some time at the end for some questions. So Margaret is going to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Margaret Musgrove, mother of George Derek Musgrove, who's the author of Chocolate City. Some of you may have heard of that since you're in that area. And the mother of Tora Musgrove, a filmmaker who did documentaries for Pixar. I have two grandsons, Walker, who is 10, and John, who is 6, both living in DC. Just a little bit about myself growing up. I grew up in Plainville, Connecticut, a small white New England town where I loved my schools, I loved my teachers, I loved my neighbors, and I loved my policemen whom we knew by name. I worked in the tobacco farms in Bloomfield, Connecticut, and in General Electric, the factory, where I did work to make enough money to keep myself and put myself at the University of Connecticut. I was shaped and loved by my Black AME Zion Church, which my great-grandfather and the elders who had migrated from North, South Carolina, and Georgia and Alabama built. I grew up in a neighborhood of immigrants from Italy, Poland, Canada, Ukraine, and Russia. Between my neighbors and my church, I enjoyed a rich cultural childhood. I've lived in Baltimore now for the last 40 years with my 20-year-old cat named Puppy. And I wrote Ashanti Dazul in 1973 as part of my doctoral work under Jane Yolen's class in Amherst. I've taught English in 3 community colleges in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and here in Baltimore, Maryland. But my last 26 years in academia were spent at Loyola University, where I was a professor of writing and the director of the Women's Center. I still have a strong desire to reconnect with my purpose and passion now that I'm retired. So it's wonderful to have been invited by you all today. And in spite of the struggles with the technology, I'm very glad to be here. We're dealing with a vital topic today in a time of great challenge to our whole way of living and our whole way of being in this country. So Wendy and I are glad to honor the humanity and authenticity of the characters in children's literature and share this work with you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Margaret. I am Wendy, and I am also very glad to be here. I grew up in upstate New York and a very white area. One of the things that Margaret and I talked about when we worked on this project several years ago was how the lack of educators that we had. And of course, being a member of the privileged race, I didn't even realize growing up that I never had an African-American teacher, that very few of the books that we looked at as children had African-American characters. And even when I was doing my master's degree in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, I don't remember in the 1980s that they highlighted the fact that we needed to be teaching children. Most of my children that I taught in North Carolina were African-American, and no one ever said to me, you should be using books that represent themselves. So as it just seems like even in the 80s that should have been something that I recognized and that somebody told me. So I did teach special education in North Carolina for 5 years. My husband and I then moved to Wyoming, and we lived there for 10 years. And that's where I did my PhD. And then I got a job at Loyola University in Baltimore. So that's where I met Margaret. And my special area of study in my PhD was children's literature. And I originally had studied primarily books that had characters with disabilities, but through some other people I met and through Margaret, I began looking more closely at books with diverse characters. So thank you for having us. what we would like to do is to know a little bit more about you. So if each of you would like to, could share some info about yourselves in the chat room and just tell us why you're interested in the topic of children's literature. So you might be a teacher or a former teacher, a grandparent, someone who's interested in social justice. Just give us a little bit of an idea of what brings you to this session and what do you hope to gain from this session. And that can be kind of ongoing. We can do that throughout the time that we have together. And then we have 3 purposes that we've come up with is to review images of Africans and African Americans in picture books published in the United States, to critically examine the pictures that we see in those picture books. And so we'll talk about how we did that. And then finally to discuss the consequences of poor representation. So those are some of the things that we hope to accomplish today. And Margaret is going to begin by talking about, she did mention she was the author of Ashanti to Zulu, which I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. And then she also wrote The Spider Weaver, and she's going to tell us a little bit about that book.
Okay. Let me start with Ashanti to Zulu and the fact that when I wrote that book, it was for my dissertation. Like Wendy, I was studying children's literature, even though I was in the department, in the education department at University of Massachusetts, and wanted desperately to write something about Africa so that some of the things that I knew would be changing over the years, so that some of those cultural things would not be lost. So I wrote Ashanti to Zulu in Jane Yolen's class, as I mentioned to you before, and sent that manuscript off. It won a contest. It didn't win the contest, but it was a runner-up in a contest, and the winners and the runner-ups were sent off to publishing houses, and Ashanti to Zulu got sent to Dial Press. And the Dillons, the story that they told me was that the Dillons were working on something, and when they saw Ashanti to Zulu, they decided that this was a manuscript that they wanted to work on. They had won the Caldecott the year before with Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears, and my guess is that they thought this was a good follow-up. So when I saw the sketches, and I'm just saying this because I was so upset with Spider Weaver pictures, when I saw the pictures of Ashanti to Zulu, they were just sketches. But because of the way the Dillons had researched their subject and because of the way they pictured their subject, I could only be thrilled by the way they were so pictured so in such a dignified way with such beautiful detail. There was nothing to be desired. The Dillons just did a magnificent job. So when Spider Weaver, I sent Spider Weaver off to Scholastic, and it was accepted by Kevin Lewis, who was an assistant editor at the time, and Julia Cairns was chosen to be the illustrator. She had never had an art lesson in her life, but she was chosen to be the illustrator of Spider Weaver. And when those pictures came back in just sketch form, I was appalled. Because like Wendy, I didn't have any Black characters in any of the books that I was going up with, going through Broad Street School in Plainville, Connecticut. All of my teachers were white, just like Wendy, from kindergarten all the way through college, through UConn, University of Connecticut. I never had a Black teacher. So I didn't ask questions. I had been acculturated by my white town and by my white neighborhood. I like Wendy, I didn't ask many questions. But when I did Spider Weaver, I was thinking about Little Black Sambo, which had been the only book with a Black character in it in my elementary years. I hated that book. I hated that face. I hated that whole picturing of a Black child in such a negative and distorted way. So when I saw the pictures from Spider Weaver that reminded me of Little Black Sambo, obviously I was disturbed and I was really upset about them. But the book had an 11-year run. And here are some of the pictures. This one on the left is the very first picture in the book. And if you look at the child, if you look at the pictures of the people that are doing the weaving, and if you look at the other pictures on the right-hand side of the the hunters, you get this sense of a black, just kind of stereotypical flat kind of character, almost like they're just a flat character that's not developed as a whole human being. And that was the way I felt about it. When I did my first presentation on this book, a little girl asked me why the people didn't have eyes. The animals had eyes, the monkeys had eyes, the elephants had eyes, and the people did not. I really had no answer for it because I hadn't done the pictures. I had looked at them and been disturbed by them, asked an Ashanti friend of mine what she thought, and her idea was to let the story come out. She said, Margaret, let the story come out. Don't stop the publishing of the book. When I tried to do some correcting, because in the Durbar, and Wendy, can we show anything? Can we show any picture of the Durbar?
Yeah, is this,
Okay, there, okay. In the Durbar, now those people are all seated. In the Durbar that Karen's picture that the illustrator drew, she had the people walking, because certainly they walk in the Durbar too, and there's, the drumming and all, there's a retelling of the history of the people and so forth. So she didn't put any shoes on the people, which is like out of the question. There's no way that anyone would attend the Durbar and not have shoes on their feet. And just the elegance of the clothes and the gold. And Wendy, can we go back to that gold, the picture of the Kenti with the gold? If that's,
yes.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
There. I mean, it's a time to show off all of your riches, your gold, your Kenti cloth, which is for the king would be a new Kenti cloth, would have a special design on it. When anyone special or any special occasion comes up, there's often a new Kenti that's created. When Bill Clinton and his wife came to Ghana, they both had Kentis made especially for them. And if you see pictures of those times, you'll see them with the Kenti draped, around their shoulders. So I was trying to show the elegance and show the dignity of the people and kind of lift up that tradition as something very beautiful, the way the history is always retold. And I just didn't get that. I didn't get that feeling from the pictures that I saw. They were just not at that level of celebration.
The other thing that Margaret and I both noticed, and I've had some students tell me as well, is if you look at the size of the heads, and it's most evident in this picture here on the left. So we have this child who has a large head, which is typical of a child, and that's, developmentally where we are. But then you have the two adult men who are doing the weaving, and they also have a larger head in proportion to their body. And so it felt to us like this illustrator was infantilizing the African people and making them less than human.
Yeah, and I think that I may not have said that quite the way Wendy did, because I agree totally with her, but I think that sometimes you don't have the words for it. You just know that something's wrong. And I think that with little children, that's what they would look at that. They might know that something's wrong. When I saw the little boy, reminds me of a child I worked with up in Stores, Connecticut, who was hydrocephalic. I mean, it's like, this could show some kind of sickness. And it certainly doesn't look like, I think that, I know Wendy, you said that you think that's more in proportion. But I think that that's even still a little bit. So on some of the other pictures, these are the pictures from the redone book. Apprentice House at Loyola University put out my second edition, which I put out myself. And I got an illustrator, Bat, I'm gonna mess up his name, Landi. And he's of African descent with a father who is directly from Africa, I think from Mali. And if you look at these pictures, and you see the muscles, the light on the picture, the light on the muscles on the man on the left that's weaving, or if you look at the picture on the right at the Durbar, you see different features. You see that these people had their own identity, own features. They're not just blobs that just happen to have a different head shape, different hair shape. And even in the picture on the bottom where you have the woman who's talking, she's animated. They're whole people. They're people with emotions. They're people with a level of humanity that you don't see in those flat figures in the first version. So, Wendy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I just think that it's important for us to start with this and kind of think about what is the picture telling you. So we have, in picture books, we always have the text and the picture, and they can tell the same story or they can tell different stories. And so what is the underlying or hidden message? And
yeah, I often say that there are two texts in a picture book. The text that is the written text, and the text that are the pictures. And they might be something that works together, or they might work against one another. And I think that in Spiderweaver, in the first version, they were obviously working they were telling two different stories, or I would not have felt so.
okay, so we're gonna start here by talking about our process of looking at children's books and kind of how we got together. And when I came to Loyola 17 years ago and I was teaching children's literature classes, somebody said, you have to meet Margaret Musgrove. And when I met her, I invited her to come to my class and tell about the books that she had written. And she told the story of Spiderweaver. At the time, she did not have the second edition, but she had these pictures that she was very unhappy with. And it was really important for my students to begin to see that. At Loyola, most of you are probably familiar with Loyola, is a primarily white institution with our students. Students are mostly white and middle class or upper middle class. And for them to hear about the impact of these pictures was so important. So after that experience, I said to Margaret, we need to do something together. We need to work together to look at literature, and it will help me to be able to look at it more critically. So we did in the, it was probably about 2008 or 9, Margaret, when we started this project.
I think so.
And we picked out a group of books that all had images of Africans or African Americans. And we took a whole year. So every week we would read one of those books. And then we would get together for an hour and we would talk about our impressions of the books. And what that did is that it gave us, even it was only one person from each race, it gave us an idea of what is this book telling me as a white person? How am I responding to it? What is it telling Margaret as an African American, and how is she responding to it? And then we were able to look at those two responses and see if there was a way for us to come to a middle, if we agreed or if we disagreed. And it was just a really wonderful experience for me. I learned so much, and I hope Margaret learned some as well.
Of course.
But we had hours of conversation. We were able to build trust between one another. And I think, you know, as the slide says, the idea that we listened to each other was very important. So what we're going to do is share a few of those books that we wrote about, and then we have a couple of other books that we'll share as well. And Margaret, do you want to start off talking about Under the Quilt of Night?
Okay. I love the beauty of this book. The pictures are so real. Look at the faces. I mean, they're just fantastic. And where the book where it says running, I mean, you can see the water looks so real. They look stressed just to be trying to move through it. And I think that Ransom just did a fantastic job. My problem with Under the Quilt of Night, and this is, I think, the only problem I had, Wendy, I'm not sure if I had any other. I said there was a premature closure about the story, in that these folks they were running to get
Yeah.
away from slavery. They were trying to get to freedom, which is kind of maybe it was kind of freedom, but they were trying to get to freedom. And I think the one thing that bothered me on the way was when the little girl was sent up to the white people's house. And I thought that that really said something about the men, because the men sent the child to the door. And I thought, I can't imagine any black men that would do that kind of thing. And it just didn't seem logical or real to me. But I guess the main thing for me was the closure, the fact that the book ended on a high note with that beautiful picture of the light, and it's like, you know, they've reached freedom. And I think that the idea that the story was over, or that this was where they were safe in this so-called place of freedom, wherever that was supposed to be, was just out of the question. They were safe now to be preyed upon by anyone because they were black, members of a caste system. They couldn't hide their blackness. So even though they were free, they couldn't possibly be free. And the language sometimes was flowery. Wish I put down there was a place where the girl said, oh, she said, I could dance, something about dancing in the light. And I thought, whoa, you know, this is not where you are. You're now, you know, fair game for anyone coming along, basically. And I felt like it was a celebration that happened too soon. So Wendy, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was looking for something else on my screen, and
that's okay.
I messed up a few times with the where we are. But whoops, let me go back to this beginning. As Margaret said, when I read this, I also loved this book, and I didn't have the negative reactions that Margaret had. The book is written by Deborah Hopkinson, and she's a white author who has written a variety of books with African-American characters, and it's illustrated by James Ransom, and I think he's from North Carolina.
He's black, right? Wendy, he's black, right?
But he's an African-American artist and has done some wonderful books. And one of the things that I loved about the book is the artistic sense that you get. And even looking at these two pictures here from the cover and at the beginning of the book, you see the care that is taken with these illustrations, and it's just beautifully done. And throughout the whole book, there is this kind of darkness that you see on these two pages. And then when they get to a place of freedom, the light opens up. And again, just the artisticness of it is, the artistry is amazing, and I really loved it. And then when Margaret and I talked, and she was telling me how that just felt untrue to her, because she knew that when the African people got to a place of freedom in the United States, they were not free. And 100 years and 150 years now, we're all beginning to recognize that. But so she felt the sense of falseness. And what we finally decided about this book is there were so many positive things that it could be shared in a classroom, but that the teacher needed to be educated and to have his or her eyes opened to be able to say to the children, look, this is what the author is saying, and this is maybe a conception of what happened when you followed the Underground Railroad and came to some level of freedom. But let's talk about why the Black people in America still weren't really free. So giving children an idea of what comes after this story would be a good way to use this really wonderful in so many ways books.
And I think we're clear that no one book can do it all. And especially when it comes to the history of a people over a 400-year time period, it's not possible. But like Wendy, I agree that this can be used as a wonderful teaching tool, and the beauty of it can't be denied. It's just that it's not the end of the story. And like Wendy was saying, we have to pick up from there and educate our children that, you know, that this is not the end of that story. Yes, it's a freedom for a hot minute maybe, but it's not the whole story.
And then we had a book that we both really liked, and this is Visiting Langston by Willie Perdomo, and this is illustrated by Brian Collier. And those are both people of color, and this is the story of a young girl living in Brooklyn who goes with her father to visit the Langston Hughes Museum. And she loves Langston, and she loves his poetry, and she talks about the things that he's written and the way that he lived in this. It's a relatively short story with very few words on the page, and that's what I was looking for. I had written down some of the language from the text, but I can't find that unless I stop sharing, so I'll not worry about that. But throughout this whole book, you can see here on the cover how there's this kind of collage background in the illustrations. And again, this beautiful young Black girl who's portrayed in such a positive way. And so we just felt like this was a great image, is a great story. It is uplifting, and it kind of speaks to children who, as we both talked about at the beginning, are maybe not used to seeing themselves in the literature.
I love the gap between her teeth. I thought that was so, you know, you don't often see an illustrator do something like that, but there are a lot of Black children, my family, and gaps between their front teeth, and it just seems so authentic, and I found that endearing. Wendy had a bit of a challenge with the language. I remember, Wendy, you didn't like the language in a way, and I think it was because it wasn't what we were used to. It's almost like this person had taken their own, you know, they had their own way of saying it, and you had to just kind of catch up with them. It's kind of like the thing that Beyonce has done, Black is King. If we watch that that movie, you could be really thrown off by the way she was doing. I said something to my daughter about, wow, I can hardly follow the storyline. And I think it's because they have their own way of doing their storyline. And it's something that you just have to give them the room to do, to be themselves, to be that original. And it's okay.
Yeah, I think also what it took me a while to realize that it was written as poetry,
Right.
and because they had it broken up on different pages, I did almost have to write it out and read it as a whole piece rather than reading the little pieces together. And so that did set me back for a little bit, that I had to think about that. Okay, Margaret, do you want to start with this one?
Oh dear. No, when do you start with this one, please?
Okay,
Just
so
call me
Just Call Me JoJo was one of those books, you know, where probably most people would see this as a negative book, or as a racist book, actually, without a lot of prompting or you know, talking through it. You just read it and you say, wow, there's something wrong with this book. And this book was written as a part of a church school curriculum, and there were several books about JoJo. We really only examined the one, but some of the things like I said, I picked up on, but then Margaret picked up on a lot more. But basically, this is a story of a young boy who's called Jojo, and he is asked by his grandmother. He lives with his father and brother, and the grandmother lives with them. That's not really indicated where the mother is, but so he's asked by his grandmother to run to the store. And the store owner, who's white, has apparently been having a lot of trouble with some black boys in the neighborhood. And so he accuses Jojo of stealing something which Jojo didn't do. And so then they get it all straightened out. And then toward the end, the father insists that Jojo go back to the store owner and apologize. Because I think he yelled back at the store owner or something, indicating that he hadn't done what the owner said. And we just both felt like this was not a book we wanted to share with any child anywhere. And you're going to find some books like that.
It was as though he had to be apologetic for being black, that his real problem was just being black, and there was nothing he could do to fix that. So even when he wasn't guilty, he had to go and apologize for what he hadn't done because he's black. And I think we didn't talk about it so specifically like that, but I think that we both kind of got that idea from that book, and we didn't have to discuss it at all because there was nothing to discuss other than the fact that it wasn't appropriate.
So, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So we thought we would also look at a few recent books that are published, multicultural books. And we looked at the 2016 Caldecott Honor Books and Winners, and we just sort of had some thoughts on those. So the one thing that we noticed when we did this project more than 10 years ago is that there are not as many books published by or for African Americans or other minorities in the United States. So when Margaret and I were chatting this morning, she was like, well, what does it look like now? So I looked up some statistics, and about 23% of children's books published in 2018 were written about children who were African American, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, and Native American. That there were 10% African American, that was the biggest percentage, but at 23%, 50% had white children primarily, and 27% had animals, so the little mouse or those kinds of things. But then it got even worse, because out of that 23%, only, and there were 10% that was written about African Americans. The authors of all the children's books, only 7% were written by people of color. Is that what we looked at, Margaret?
I think so, yeah, that's what I have written down.
So it was like,
Yep, 7%.
it is still very difficult to get published if you are a person of color. So this book, Last Stop on Market Street, was written by Matt De La Pena, and he's a pretty well-known children's book author. And this is a story of a Latina grandmother and her grandson taking a bus ride to get to their stop, which is the last stop, and the conversations that they have back and forth. And we just looked at this briefly. Margaret, why don't you tell them a little bit of your reaction to this book?
My reaction was that it was romanticized, that it made the difficulties and the squalor possibly of the ghetto seem comfortable. The grandmother put a good face on everything, which is good. But reading it, I thought, well, I live in a place what might be called ghetto here in Baltimore, Maryland. And grandmothers that are taking care of children, whether Latinx or African American, are often strapped. You know, they're not in a good place. They don't have a lot of money. They don't all necessarily want to be a parent to a child that they're a grandmother to. And I just felt like it wasn't true. And there was a man that played the guitar on the bus for people, and people were happy that he was playing. And the bus driver had some little gift for the child, and it was just all too sweet, rosy, and I don't think riding the bus like that in Baltimore is like that down Greenmount Avenue, for example. I just don't. I just think that it's somehow made too rosy. It's a rosy picture of what it's like to not have a car and have to take the bus all the time and go down the street where there's trash on the street, and it's not a pretty picture. He made it a pretty picture, but it's not. That was my response to it.
And again, that was not something that I had noticed right away when I had read this book. So that's one of the reasons why we feel like it's so important to have two views. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a white view and an African-American view, but have more than one person look at a book when you're trying to decide what kind of story is this book telling. We also saw in 2016, another one of the honor books was Voice of Freedom, Fannie Lou Hamer. And this book, we didn't really analyze, but just to give you a little background, it is a biographical picture book, but it has a lot of text. So a lot of times picture books will only have 1 or 2 sentences on a page. And this book has a full page of text and then a picture opposite it. And so it goes through that way. And it is for a little bit older reader than a lot of picture books that are examined, but the artwork was honored by the Caldecott. And it is written about maybe a little bit lesser known person from the civil rights era who had stood up for her own rights.
Mm-hmm. And didn't they have some historical pieces or something in it, Wendy, so that it's done in a way where you get a good sense of who this person is. I thought
there's a lot of
there's a lot of good. It's a good one. I think it's
right.
got something to really help kids understand who she was.
Okay, and then we had also winning an honor in 2016 was another multicultural book called Trombone Shorty. And it is an autobiographical. Margaret and I were talking about that this morning too, and I couldn't remember, but it was actually written by Trombone Shorty, Troy, excuse me, Troy Andrews, and illustrated again by Brian Collier, who did another one of the books that we looked at just a little while ago. So when we look at these books, sometimes we look at the authenticity of the author and of the illustrator. And so this book would be 100% authentic, that it is written by an African-American and illustrated by an African-American who were able to share their experiences. And this is again, a little different than the Fannie Hamer book because it's much shorter and fewer words on the page, but just gives us a little background on Trombone Shorty.
And how he grew up, and you feel the excitement, kind of. You feel the joy, his joy, and the music, and it's good. It's something that would be really good to share with.
Yeah. So we see that in this year of 2016, the Caldecott Committee was able to sort through all these picture books, many primarily written about white children, and a much smaller percentage written about people of color. And 3 of those books rose to the top that they received a Caldecott honor. But then you see the book that won the medal in that same year, which I'm not saying that this shouldn't have won. I'm just saying that we have 3 books that are honored that are multicultural, but the committee ended up choosing as the top book, illustrated book that year, is a book called Finding Winnie, the true story of the world's most famous bear, who's Winnie the Pooh. And so it just was interesting to me to look at why they might have picked this book over one of the multicultural books. And partly, I think that it's because that's what they're comfortable with. So the people who are choosing these awards, you know, I'm sure they had people of color on the committee, but the majority of the committee would be white. And for them to look at these 3 books that we just looked at that are multicultural, finely illustrated books, and they choose a book about a fictional bear.
Right.
And it just, to me, that's a disappointment. But I think that is what our authors of multicultural books face. First, it's harder for them to get published, and then they rise. It's almost like that glass ceiling, you know,
Yeah,
they can go up
that's a
so
good point.
high, but we're not
Right.
going to have you as the winner. So it was just kind of interesting.
And it's also like what's important, you know, that bear and the story of the bear were more important than the lives of people. Do you know what I mean? It just seems like that the emphasis was on what's important to maybe white people, like you said, rather than the other communities that the books kind of represented.
Yeah. So we have 2 questions. What else do you want to talk about, or what questions do you have for us? And I'm going to stop sharing so we can then look at everybody's faces, see who's here, and yeah, open it up to questions.
I have
Okay.
one.
Connie, go ahead.
Why is it, I had heard from my friend writing the children's book that she has no control over the artwork at all. She'll see it when it's pretty much final. And that is such a prescription for, I don't want to say disaster, but huge disappointment. And there's no, it seems like the rules for looking at text and looking at art are different. People don't know what they, I mean, anyway, it's exasperating, and it's too bad you had to spend your own money re-illustrating your book, Margaret, but isn't there some way that can change? It's up to the publishers, I guess.
It's up to the publishers. I think that, you know, when you sign a contract, and I think that when you're young and you're dumb and you don't know what you're really signing, you say, oh yeah, of course I want them to supply pictures for my book. But what happens is that the control over those pictures is in their hands and not in your hands. And you can take it or leave it, basically. Yeah. You know, if you want the book published, you'll go with the pictures that we have chosen for you, or you won't be published. When I tried to make the changes in Spiderweaver, what was frustrating about it was that you could make these minor little changes, like put sandals on the people's feet, or make the head wrap look less like a rag than a wrap. And there were different things that you could do, but the spirit of those pictures could really not be changed. And my friend Eileen Wilson, who lived with me in Ghana, said, Margaret, you know, you can't really change what those pictures are doing. And she was right. And when they did change them, there was one smile in the book. The illustrator, for some reason, took the smile off the woman's face so that when that book came out, there was not, just look, if you get a chance to look at that book, Spiderweaver, the first, you know, one that came out in 2001, there is not one smile in that book. And the men behind the web look like they're in jail to me. So that the whole feeling of that book is not one of celebration or one of love, you know, for that subject. It was totally sabotaged. And your friend is right. You don't have any choice about the pictures, unless I guess you could negotiate that if you're smart enough up front. And I certainly was not. I wasn't experienced enough.
Carolyn, did you have a question or a comment?
I'll pass at this point. That was a point well taken, and it's not sequitur. I'll wait.
Okay.
Add that this is the first time I ever noticed that the way that the author and the illustrator are given equal billing in children's literature. It seems obvious in retrospect, but I just never noticed it. So that must be part of the problem, that they're seen as equal, so one can't dictate the other unless the one who starts first is smart enough to, as you said, Margaret, get it in the contract.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's fair that they should not be interfered with when they're doing their work. Like when the Dillons did all my pictures, did their pictures for Ashanti the Zulu, I never spoke with them one time. I didn't see the Dillons until the Caldecott banquet. I never spoke with them, never saw them. The editor did all of the going between the two of us. And when it came to Spiderweaver, again, it was the same thing. I've never spoken to Julia Cairns. I think she wrote to me once, but we've never really spoken. They keep you apart. It's a way of their controlling, the whole project and keeping you from interfering with the other artist's work.
I can't, is it Letney?
Sarah, yeah. I'm just curious. I felt my daughter-in-law and I both been involved with educating young children for many years, and we have talked many times that I don't think children's literature reflected real life. It was always an idealized kind of unrelatable kind of thing until relatively recently. When did we start caring whether anybody was genuinely portrayed? When did that start happening in our children's literature? Because it was certainly not when I was growing up in the 50s, and she doesn't recall it when she was growing up in the 80s. So when did we start caring whether or not characters in a book were relatable for children?
I would say that across the board, it did start about in the 70s, where there were some books, and probably it started in chapter books. So you can think about Judy Blume is often mentioned as someone who wrote about real problems.
But not picture books.
Yeah. And then it did move into picture books. But I think the other thing with both chapter books and picture books for children is that we still have this range. So we saw Last Stop on Market Street, which is an idealized version of what it means to be poor in America.
Right.
And then we could have something, and I think one of the things that Margaret and I noticed in our paper when we were looking at all of the books together was that there were just a lot of books that told, Margaret called it the happy Black family. And whether that's realistic or not, it's something that we would all agree does need to be portrayed. But it doesn't have to be in every book.
But also there's like A Chair for My Mother. A Chair for My Mother?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So like, I would say that was it was idealized, of course, but books should be something children want to go to.
Right.
But to me, that was a very, and then the irony of I'm the grandmother saying, I'm just young, glad we're young and we can start over.
Yeah.
But that kind of idealization, I'm trying to say, when you're in a grim place, it's good to have some of that, isn't it?
I would say yes. And you think about, what do adults like to read? And a lot of adults like to read romance novels, and
Mhm.
whether or not they're realistic,
Right.
but
Right.
that it makes them feel good. So
Yeah.
we shouldn't take away things that make children feel good.
Right.
And so but I think that there needs to be a variety of genres
Mhm.
offered to children.
Mhm,
So
mhm, mhm.
um, that's something that I would say last 20 or 30 years, people have begun to recognize that we need
Okay,
to
so
tell
recently.
everyone's story.
Yeah.
I was thinking of Dick and Jane, Sally, Spot, and Puff, and how. Do you remember, some of you, that we read those books? That we
Yeah.
read those books every. See Spot Run, yes. I was thinking about those books, and there's a happiness to them. There's a kind of, everything is all right. This world is perfect. But there are people like me growing up that were never, ever part of that.
But I don't think any of us were part of it.
Okay.
I did not. I read Sister Anne, in Catholic school. We had Sister Anne and all that, and I felt truly alienated from that, because being in a Catholic family, there were 8 of us, and nobody was around to be cutting up sandwiches in halves, and,
Right.
and nobody had money to go get a popsicle from the popsicle man. So that's when I say I don't think we cared whether or not a kid related in those days.
Mhm.
No, we didn't.
I sure
Yeah.
didn't relate to those things.
Mhm.
I see. I see.
Yeah.
I had a comment about the initial illustrations that you had in the slide presentation, and I was struck by my absolutely opposite opinion of them, because I love seeing the abstract personification of characters. And so when I saw it and then heard what you said about it, it introduced a different perspective on it, similar to the way you, Margaret, and you, Wendy, enjoyed and reading books together, seeing different things in different books.
Right.
Because I come to books from a more or less a realistic point of view. So seeing illustrations that are abstract is a wonderful departure for me.
Mhm.
So that was my reflection initially when I saw your slide. That's all.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
I just think that when you have so few depictions of Africans and African culture and African tradition,
Yeah.
and the distortions and the stereotypes that we've learned in this country in our school systems, that to throw something else like that out there doesn't help move us forward in a better and more humanistic way of understanding one another. That was my sense of it. I
Yes.
guess if there had been 10 books about Kenty and they had all been realistic with real looking people, I might have felt better about those little blobs of black on the paper.
Uh-huh.
But because this was the only representation, and I had worked so hard to bring forth the regalness of the cloth and the tradition, I felt really upset about it.
Well, just to respond, I had a very stark attraction to the muscles of the people that were depicted in a more realistic way. I mean, especially the way the woman was lifting her skirt when she was the first young woman in the one about the runaway families of
Oh,
slaves.
yes.
Those pictures were, I really, really liked those a whole lot. So it was a different kind of appeal, but
Right.
But-
And I think
different perspectives. Likes.
the other thing that Margaret and I talked a lot about is, just because we did this project and I'm white and she's black, it didn't mean all white people are going to react the way I did. And it didn't mean all black people would react this way Margaret did. That we were 2 people sharing. And our real point, and Carolyn, you bring out a good point, is that people should talk to each other, so that when teachers are presenting these books, they're ready to listen to what the children have to say about them as well. And that children are going to have different reactions. And so we want to make sure all of that. Gary, I saw that you had your hand up.
Yes. As you said, the prime mover in all these books is the publisher, and the publisher is in business to make money. And so presumably they're going to publish what will sell the most books. And so they think at least there must be a market for the more stereotype kind of thing. You make a comment on that?
I think there is something to be said for what you're saying. I think the other thing is that the publishers are largely controlled by white males. And
Right.
so we have this cycle of what do we think children will read? What do we think women will read? What do we think African Americans will read? And, one thing that's really interesting, and Margaret can probably speak more to this than I can, is to think about what Toni Morrison did in publishing, that not only was she writing her own books, but she was a prime mover in getting some
That's
well-known African Americans published. And without her influence, they would never have seen the light of day. So, it takes someone to get in there and influence those publishers, because those books will sell if they're well written.
And yeah. Well, I was thinking about Kevin and how Kevin said to me, Kevin Lewis, the one who published Spiderweaver out of Scholastic, he said, if I have to lie in front of the door of my editor's door and kick my feet and bang on the door or whatever, I'm going to, work on getting the books that I want published. So what he was suggesting to me was that there was resistance. Okay. But when Spiderweaver came out, it had a good run for 11 or 12 years. And it was selling, and selling in hard copy and paperback. So, I think these books have to get a chance. Kevin gave it a chance. But I think that what Wendy is saying about the fact that there are, and the publishers are white men, it's a harder sell. So that
Anansi is a very good old, how do I say? Goes way back older than Winnie the Pooh. Anansi is originally in the oral tradition,
right?
And we have a copy of Peggy Apia's Anansi tales, and those are obviously her trying to transcribe the oral tradition, and I think that tradition has been because it's such a core thing that maybe the fact of it being Anansi helps people say, oh yes, Anansi. Do you know what I'm trying to say? That the topic makes it more accessible, maybe.
Maybe. I don't think everyone knows Anansi like you do. I think you're unusual.
But there was I had an old, ugly black and red and black and orange book and it was about Anansi, and it wasn't a very good one.
Okay.
That I used with my boys and girls, and it wasn't even a good one. And they would pore over it, and I go, well, Anansi, and I would say, well, Anansi is just like our spiders that I don't let you touch, just stomp. Anansi tries to teach children about how to live in a family or in a village,
right.
And that was
right.
It was like, and I had a lot of black kids, and their parents did not seem. It was like, oh yes, Anansi. I mean, that was something that somehow
they had heard of.
Yes. Not real clear on who or what, but kind of like Shakespeare quotes, you've heard it before, not quite sure where.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. Margaret mentioned that the Spiderweaver book had an 11-year run, but Ashanti to Zulu was published in 76 or 77, and it's still selling, and it's still being translated into other languages. So And from your perspective, it's a much more positive book in terms of the images. So
Yeah.
what do you think it is that caused that to be such
Yeah,
a
good point.
perennial book or a classic book now?
Ooh, I don't know. And you know, Cheryl, Ta-Nehisi Coates gave it a shout out for some reason. It was one of his first as a child. It was one of his favorite books. So not that that made it so. I'm just throwing that out, that people are aware of that book for some reason. And I've told you, and I don't know if I told you, Wendy, it's published in Chinese and it's in French. And because it's a Caldecott, it's published in perpetuity. So God just gave me this gift of this book that, has a wide audience. And if it starts selling in China, I imagine that will be amazing. I have mixed feelings about the Chinese language with it, but I think that's because the Chinese seem to be the new colonizers in Ghana, and that doesn't feel so good. I wonder why they went to Chinese rather than Spanish, because there are lots of people in this country that speak Spanish that would like to know probably about Ashanti de Zulu, but I don't know, Cheryl. I don't think I'm answering your question, Cheryl. I'm sorry. I don't think I'm answering. I don't know. I think I don't know the answer. Wendy?
Yeah, I think the Caldecott winning, but it does have it has a lot of curb appeal. So, if I came across that book in a bookstore, it still is very appealing.
Yeah.
Vanessa had a question.
So two things. First and foremost, I'm so impressed and intrigued by the fact that the two of you got together and did this project for a year where you really sat and looked at books together. So I want to acknowledge that, because to me, that sounds like a really wonderful thing. So number one. I'm curious to ask Margaret, when you put the new illustrations in Spiderweaver, how was that? Did it start selling again?
Oh, Apprentice House is a publishing house within Loyola University. And it's in the writing, I think it's the writing department. Because I was in writing and media, they've split up, so right now I can't tell you definitively, but Apprentice House is Loyola's publishing house, run by students. So what happens to us, I'm selling it on Amazon, but the truth is I don't have the mechanisms. I'm not a publisher. That's not my shtick, kind of. So I'm dependent on finding a way to be a publisher myself, because Apprentice House isn't trying to sell it. They're students. That's a student press, but they're not going beyond just putting it out there. And we've had these special celebrations of the books that are published by Apprentice House, but as far as being real, distributors, they're not. So it's a hard sell. The new book still has to find its way. I have to find its way to get it out there. Thank you for asking that.
And by talking to people like us, you might have found a way.
Yeah, thank you. I hope so.
Connie, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, yes, actually, I think it's been answered though. So the Spiderweaver that had the 11 or 12-year run is with the old illustrations, not the new illustrations.
Yeah, because that's with Scholastic, and Scholastic is selling in book clubs. Scholastic sells everywhere, all over the country, to schools, all kinds of schools. I mean, they have the market.
And then they did Harry Potter, of course. But at the same time, I'd also love to know, are you all working on children's books now? You have books in the works?
Are you writing something now, Margaret? I think you are.
Well, I was writing about the whole Sambo image from what I had experienced with it. And I've got a box of notes, and you're inspiring me to go back to that box and think, I've got to do something with this, especially in this racial climate that we're in now. So yes, I have something, but I need to put my nose to the grindstone and really get working.
Minadora? You're still
Margaret,
unmuted.
yeah, Margaret, being that you're talking about the Sambo image, will that be for adults, an adult book for children to explain to the child?
Yes,
Okay,
this would be a book written for parents.
all right.
Thank you for asking that, yes.
Patricia?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say this has been really enjoyable. I don't have a direct connection to children's literature, but I was an adoption worker and a librarian. So, you know, some connection to books and to children through that. And I was a big reader as a kid. And I'm thinking it would be nice to have a mix between the two versions of the book about the kente cloth, because my reaction to the ones that had the realistic pictures was, well, it's kind of like a book you'd expect to have a lot of text, and it didn't look like a lively story going on. And just from the few pictures that we saw, the other one with the more abstract, I thought of collage kind of pictures, looked as though there was a lively story going on, even though, you know, the pictures themselves weren't the greatest. And I get what Margaret meant about the men looking not too happy behind the looms and all. But I wish somebody could do something that showed the glory of kente cloth, because there are beautiful art books that really show it, and it should have that book for the kids. But what I really wanted to comment on was when I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of money, but you know, we lived in my grandmother's house, so there was that. But I was always a nervous Nelly kind of kid. I would not have wanted to read any book that didn't have an uplifting ending if I was in a difficult situation. I would have only wanted and been helped by books that showed there were possibilities, things could be better. So I loved the picture at the end of the people escaping, because I'm sure once they were safely out of actually being slaves, and somebody could literally do whatever to you, that was a moment of great joy and relief. And some people got in difficulties afterwards, maybe a lot, not everybody, and not for all the time. So I wouldn't want to tell a child that that's not realistic. They should be able to celebrate that. That's great. Kids need hope more than they need reality, because they've got reality around them. That's kind of my take on it from my childhood. I had quite enough reality because I worried too much in the first place. And, you know, I just wanted ones, I still do, you know, that had some kind of happy ending. And you never know. If you were to look at the story of someone in Africa who as a little boy had, let's see, a severe injury, he was in the hospital, then later he had TB, but there was this white clergyman who came and visited him every week, and he got well. And you could end the book there with, you know, whoa, this is great, you know, this nice thing happened. And it wouldn't be true that bad things, well, some bad things did happen, but on the other hand, this man turned out to be Desmond Tutu, so great things also happened. I don't see why the white kids should have all the books that have the happy endings. I don't think that's a bad thing if they have happy endings. Though I agree it's not a bad thing to have accurate depictions. But as a librarian, I've noticed a lot of the books, more for older kids, I admit, they were kind of grim, a lot of them. And they were showing, you know, difficulties. And I thought there should be better stuff. But that's it.
On a similar note, I remember really loving the book A Snowy Day. And because I was of that age, I got it from Scholastic Books actually. And I don't really remember thinking about the fact that the main character was of color, which is fascinating now that it comes out that he was. I just think that was an interesting point.
And that is A Snowy Day is a great representation, interestingly enough, written and illustrated by a white man.
Right, that's right.
I can't think of his name right now, but
I can't either.
It
Where's the librarian? The librarian will know.
The librarian knows how to look it up real quick.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, but
Oh, and the
It
librarian
was
forgot the
Ezra
most
Jack
important.
Keats, wasn't it? Wasn't
okay.
it
Who was it?
Ezra Jack Keats?
Yes, Ezra Jack Keats. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
Um,
Thank you.
The
Good job.
librarian just forgot the most important book in my life
What?
because it was a children's book. Well, teenage, probably older children.
Mhm.
That I was growing up in Alabama. I'm sure I took all of the attitudes the adults around me had for granted without question, because kids do.
Right.
I read this book. Main character was white, but he had a dog, and that's why I was reading the book. He made a friend who was African American, and something happened to the guy that was prejudiced. You know, it was pretty obvious in the book that they were treating him badly in some way because he was black. Nothing deadly or anything like that, but just, you know, being prejudiced. And I thought, well, that's not right. And then I started looking around at everything that was going on around me. This was like, you know, late 50s in Alabama, and saying, boy, this is really not right. I do not like this. My racial attitudes did a complete 180 in the course of reading that book.
Wow.
That's really
That's powerful.
It's great, and we love
That's
to hear
powerful.
that. I do want to respond just a little bit, and I'll give Margaret a chance to respond too. But so again, it's not that we say you shouldn't have happy endings, or that, but I think it is important that children today recognize that getting out of slavery was not the end of oppression. And that was what Margaret related to, I think, is
Yes.
that idea that the oppression isn't over. And we now, you know, I think 2020, the one good thing that has come out this year is the attention that we're beginning to pay to that horrible story of, you know, 60 or 80 years in Jim Crow, and then, you know, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and mass incarceration, and all of those things are ways that African Americans, not every single one, but as a group in our country, are still being oppressed. And so that happy ending picture is fine. We do like that book, but I think that all children need to know that wasn't the end. And whether you do it in conjunction with that book, or if you share other books, so that that's not the only story being told.
Right.
And that, Margaret.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I agree totally. It's just that the story doesn't end there. That's all.
Right, right.
If I may ask a question concerning that.
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to see what you said really is really critical for me. And you said that, you know, the ending, the oppression still continues. And that message is who is the audience for that message? And I think more often than not, it needs to be the white kids, so that they learn that racial prejudice is not a good thing, and maybe change their thought process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Through
Well,
that
certainly
message to that.
their eyes do need to be opened. And but I think also the Black kids need to hear it, because they're living it, and yet they're expected in school to almost negate their own reality, because we're often teaching them you're free, and they're not free.
No.
So you know, I think that they need to hear it too, to sort of acknowledge the reality that they're living.
Right.
I
But some
think
of the books need to be tailored so that the white parent also would pick up that book and say, yeah, my kid needs to read this, or know about it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate everything you all are doing. I'm just in general interested in the whole subject of social, racial justice.
I think that most of the authors are writing for both Black and white children. They're writing for all children. I know I wrote Ashanti de Zulu for all children, not just for Black children.
Right, right.
So it's, you know, I think that
Really
with
important.
writing like that, yeah.
Yeah.
But we're all pretty much, I know I was a acculturated white growing up in Plainville, Connecticut. And a whole lot of Black kids in the suburbs or wherever they find themselves in a more privileged school, say they're, you know, they get acculturated white. So that you're thinking one thing about yourself and your reality may slap you in the face at some point and say, no, that's not where you belong. That's not for you. You know, so that there's a contradiction in being acculturated one way and being in a caste system at the same time.
Mhm. Thank you.
Well, we have about 6 or 7 minutes left. So if there are any wrap-up questions, or Wendy or Margaret, if you have any final words. All right. I hear crickets, so I think it's my job to thank the two of you for this really fascinating presentation. I think it's deeply meaningful to those who are now grandparents or becoming grandparents, and a new way of looking more carefully at how we can use literature and encourage young readers to open their worlds to new concepts and new approaches. So thank you very much for today. Thank you for what you've done professionally, and also thanks to Cheryl again for recommending these two to come present to us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, thank you.
And Jane, thank you for your comments about Ezra Jack Keats. Those are, if everybody wants to take a moment to look at that, really interesting, and I appreciate the.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank
you're
you.
welcome. The article's pretty good, and down towards the bottom, they were saying, teachers were saying for the first time children were using darker colors to draw pictures of themselves.
Ah,
And he was
yeah.
the first, or one of the first, to start doing positive attributes to African-American children.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think at the time, he was not considered white. He was considered Jewish. You know, that was still the time of lots of anti-Semitism and quotas. And, you know, I went to a lecture at Howard University about how historic Black colleges and universities welcomed refugee professors, and how they were, I'll say, integrated into the schools.
Right.
And then when they had a choice, especially down south, when they had a choice of either joining in with the, I'll say, white community, there were so many rules they didn't want it. They just left that. So they said, you know what? I'm just staying in the African-American community.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, Doug, thank you for helping us with the Zoom and getting it together.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I will send you the link for the recording too. So you'll have.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much, Doug. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye, Margaret.
Bye, Wendy. See you.
Okay.
We'll talk.
Bye.